you would be willing to share some of the times in your life where you surrendered, where maybe you were at that point, or what does that point feel like for you, and how you dealt with this, and maybe specifically was your knowledge that you learned, theosophical knowledge, pertinent to the situation, or was it your knowledge in general, or how did you deal with that point in that place?
All right. Well, obviously, I think everybody can point to some time when, you gave in. Gave in, right? Actually, there's a beautiful fellow wrote the book Varieties of Religious Experience, or William James, yeah. And there's an expression he uses that he calls, the book is about, in large measure, it's about the nature and descriptions of people's internal experience of mystical experience. And so he talks about people describing something where really they would describe it as if their ordinary frame of reference, their ordinary consciousness becomes overrun. And he uses the word invasion of consciousness, which I love it, because it expresses something that, the sort of borders that we carry around, that define us. There are moments and there are points where, for whatever reason, those borders just become overrun. And then, like it or not, you find yourself the captive, or you surrender to this higher power. I should say, too, this whole idea of surrendering to a higher power. There are a lot of spiritual movements in the world today. But quite honestly, if I had to point toward any one that I think has had the deepest impact on human society, it would be the variety of 12-step programs. Yeah, because if I'm not mistaken, the very first step is recognition that I don't know the exact words, but recognition of a higher power, that there is something beyond just my will. And the people that come to a 12-step program are people who have been beaten down to the point of surrender by their behaviors and by their addictions. And so when you see that how many millions of people this has assisted in their recovery, and that it is based on a simple spiritual principle, I point to that as one of those organizations that is probably one of the most powerful in terms of reorienting people's lives. In my own case, I can think of a number of things. Well, let me tell you a story. You all like stories, I hope. And this isn't a story about a fairy tale or something like that. This is a story about something that occurred with me. For many years, I didn't speak about it at all. Not that it's something that needed to be hidden or was a source of shame, but it was just something that was so close to me that I just didn't feel as if it was something that I would share in that way. Found myself talking about it some years ago with a group. It was a small group, theosophical group. So anyway, the reason I'm standing up here in front of you today is not because I searched for and found the Theosophical Society, and in my openness to this spiritual approach, I realized that the things that I am looking for, I have found here. That's not my story. I was not looking for this. I didn't know that such a thing as the Theosophical Society existed. And if it did exist, I didn't know what it was about or what its use might be. The way I found my way over here And it relates to this whole thing of surrender. As a 19-year-old, I was in college, and I had a spring break coming up. And as many college students, I was looking to get away and do something ideally wild and crazy. Yeah. And I had a cousin who lived in Chicago. And I hadn't seen him in a couple of years, but hanging out with Barrett would have fit that description. I knew I could get something wild and crazy with him because he was renowned for being undisciplined and getting into things. So I figured this would be a good spring break. And I went out to Chicago, and it didn't take too very long for me to recognize that the couple of years that had elapsed since the last time I saw him had brought about some sort of change. Because the guy I was looking for, he wasn't showing many signs of it. You know, I got with him, and you know, we're talking, and he starts to talk about things like reincarnation, karma. And these are not party words. So I'm thinking, wait a minute. And then, you know, I listen to this, and I say, oh, yeah. And I hadn't heard any of this stuff, so it was just kind of like water rolling off a duck. It didn't touch me at all. And then I noticed a couple of mornings, we'd get up in the morning, and Barrett was one of these people, you know, it would take an earthquake to get him out of bed before noon. But he's up early in the morning, and I get up and I look, and he's across the room, we're sharing a room, and he's sitting down with his legs crossed, facing the wall. You know, and I'm there, and I don't want to disturb whatever this is that he's doing. But, you know, I have an eye open, and I'm looking. And I watch him. And basically what I see that he's doing is nothing. He's just sitting there. And so that's odd. So I say to him at a point, I say, Barrett, you know, I noticed you're getting up in the morning, and you're sitting down. He says, oh, yeah, I'm meditating. And so here's another term that rolls on. But then throughout all of this, it got to a point where I said to him at one point, I said, well, you know, Barrett, you know, I haven't seen you in a couple of years, and no doubt about it, you've changed. And so he says, well, yeah, you know, Tim, you should meet my teacher, the old man. And probably to you all, that would be something that would be very inviting. It's like, oh, great, I'm going to meet his teacher, the old man. But you have to forgive me, but 19-year-old looking for a party experience, and I've been through this stuff about reincarnation, karma, meditation, and now I'm hearing the thing we need to do is go meet a teacher who is an old man. I just felt my whole vacation slipped away. You know, at that moment I said, it's lost. Just give up, you know. This wasn't the sort of surrender I'm talking about yet. So anyway, he takes me by to see this guy, the old man. And, you know, we come in, and it's a few of us that came. Another one of his friends we picked up and went home. And we come in, and they knew him, I did not. So we sit down, he's talking about a bunch of things, a few of us in the room. And it was interesting. I can't really tell you anything that he said. He was a charismatic kind of fellow, and he spoke very positively. The one thing I do remember clearly was at one point, this guy that came with us, his name was Al. And he had had a headache when we picked him up, and he's sitting in the room, and he's just, you know, apparently he had a very bad headache, so he's just rubbing his head. So at one point, the old man says to him, say, Al, see you're having a headache. He says, oh yeah, old man, it's really killing me. So he says, okay, well, why don't, he says, Larry, Calvin, why don't you take Al's headache? It's okay. I'm sitting there watching this, and I'm looking for somebody to get up, go to the medicine cabinet in the bathroom, you know, get some Bayer aspirin, come back, give it to him, and take his headache. But no, they take a chair and put it in the middle of the floor. They say, okay, I'll sit here. And then one stands in front, one stands in back. They rub their hands together. And just hold it like that. They don't touch it. For about 30 seconds. Shake their hands like that and walk away. Okay. So as far as I can tell, nothing has happened. But Al gets up, he says, "Oh man, that feels so much better." And he goes and sits down. And so you have to, again, put yourself in my position. Yeah. It's like, to you all and to me now, this is so normal, it's just like, breathing air. But I'm looking, and I don't have any place to put this in my mind. It's nothing I've seen. And in fact, what did I? Nothing happened. So, I just let that one float. But I remember that one. So it comes time to leave. We'd been there a little while, and we get up to go. And so we go to the door, and we're taking we're saying our farewells. And I was going back to New York City. I'd driven out there from New York and was driving back, leaving early the next morning. So we get to the door, and I say, "Well, it's been nice meeting you. Bye." And he looks at me, and he says, he shakes my hand, and he smiles. And he says, "I'll see you soon, son." And, at this point, he had been talking so positively all along, but I knew this one is wrong, because I'm leaving, like 4 o'clock the next morning. So I tell him, "Well, I don't think so, because I'm leaving very early in the morning." And he keeps on smiling. And he says it again. He says, "I'll see you soon, son." So what do? I say, "Okay, I'll see you soon." It's like, this guy is starting to worry me. So we leave, go back home to where my cousin is, and I start packing and find that something that I brought is missing. And so we're tearing up the house trying to find it. Can't find it anywhere. I hadn't left the house, it was there. Couldn't find it. And so finally, after a while, my cousin comes up with this bright idea. And the idea is, why don't we ask the old man? That was it for me. I lost it, quite honestly. At that point, I said, "Okay, it's time to take the gloves off with my cousin now, because this is ridiculous." And I went through the whole kind of Perry Mason lawyer show thing with him. I said, "Barrett, let me ask you a question." He says, "Yeah." I said, "What street is this?" He said, "Well, this is 83rd Street." I said, "Right, 83rd, right? What street does the old man live on?" 33rd. I said, 83rd Street? To me, this is utterly convincing. 83rd Street? 33rd Street? What is he going to know about something happening 5 miles away that he's not involved in any kind of way? And then I stood back, because it's like, my case has just been won, So I stand back, and I'm waiting for his response. And it was the oddest thing, really. Here in my moment of victory, of logic, my cousin, he just looks at me. And I should say, I grew up in New York. So in New York, you have a lot of, it used to be you had people who were homeless, and often they were homeless because they had sort of mental issues. And you could always kind of tell, because they'd be carrying shopping bags. And they used to talk about bag ladies and they'd be walking around kind of having conversations, and nobody's there. And you get this kind of, when they go by, you kind of look, and it was this pity look, I feel sorry for them, but for the grace of God, there go I, or some sort of look. But I'm looking after I've made my point with my cousin, and he's looking at me like that. Like I'm the crazy one. And I said, this thing was just getting thicker and thicker. So anyway, I just let that go. And we went out, and for the time we had left that night, we went to a couple of places. And then I didn't know Chicago then, but I saw we were pulling up, and I recognized this building we're pulling up in front of. And it was a place where we had come earlier in the day to spend time with the old man. So Barrett says, "Come on," and we go ring the bell, come in. And we had to go upstairs, because he had had a surgery Actually, when he sat down there with us that day, he was quite tired. I didn't know it because he just had a very fresh surgery. So we go upstairs, and he's laying down, and there are a couple of guys there around. And, we come into the room, and he's laying there, and he looks at me. And he just smiles. And then he says, hey, we meet again, don't we? And I had forgotten it. But then I said, oh my God, he told me that. And then the next thing he said was, the thing you came to ask me about, you'll get your answer when you get back to New York. And then he just switched gears completely. And what he started talking to me about was, he really started talking to me about the ageless wisdom, about who I am. And he had a way of doing it. I haven't encountered it in any books. He had a way of speaking that as a 19-year-old, you could get it. And he spoke to me, and he talked about a whole bunch of things. One of the things he says, you're sitting here right now, and you got your little blue jeans, and he described my outfit, my coat, and all that. And he said, this is what you present to the world. This is what you want people to see. He said, but when I look at you, I can see a whole lot more than that. And then he started to describe how, who you are. And he talked about this, he used the term the 7 bodies that you can function in complete awareness, the physical, the emotional, all those sorts of things. He used different terms. And as if he didn't really have my attention enough, at one point he starts going into describing to me very clearly, incidents in my life. I'm the only one there seeing it. I'm the only one there doing it. And he's describing it just like he's watching the scene there with me. I mean, he was a profoundly clairvoyant man. And so then he talked on, and he talked, and he talked. And at a certain point, he stops. And he says to me, he says, you know what, son? You probably better get up and go now. And at this point, I didn't want him to stop. And I told him, I said, no, that's all right. Please keep on talking. I need to hear this. The strange thing about how he was talking was, everything he was talking about, I had never heard any of it in my lifetime. Not a peep of any of this had I ever heard. But every single thing he was talking about was so utterly familiar to me. It was just, these are things that I knew somewhere inside, but I had never heard it. And so as he talked, just one thing after another just felt like it was just opening up. So he says, it's time for you to go. I said, no, keep on talking. He says, well, don't you remember you have to leave early this morning? I said, that's fine. When that moment gets here, we'll take care of it, but please don't stop. He said, take a look at your watch. And I look at my watch, and it's about 3 o'clock in the morning. And I had been sitting in this chair. I hadn't moved from this chair for 4 hours? And it was just as if, it had just started. So anyway, I leave. I go back to New York. When I get there, I have a couple of days before I have to get back to school. I was going to school in Providence, Rhode Island. And so during that time in New York, the place where my family lived was right across the street from a park. And I went out to the park because I wanted to take a walk and I wanted to think about some of these things he had told me. And so I found myself out in the park walking. And as I was walking, I was trying to remember some of these things that he said, but he had said so much. One of the things he said at one point was, he said, you know what? He said, I have a little mantra that I say, and it's one that I created for myself. He said, but I'm going to share it with you. He said, think about it. It might do you some good. So he shared this mantra with me. And the way it went was, I know that I am a spark from from that eternal flame. I'm a grain of sand on this beach of life. I am related to a blade of grass, correlated to a leaf on a tree. I am part of the universal all. What can be denied me? It's powerful. It's beautiful. I'm walking in the park and I'm thinking about this mantra, but I have one problem. I can't remember it. I could remember one line. The only part I remembered was, I am a grain of sand on this beach of life. And I found myself walking and trying to ask myself, I said, well, what does that mean? And as I thought about it, I thought about a beach. How many billions of grains of sand are there on a beach? And I said, oh my God, grain of sand, that's like nothing. I'm like, nothing. And then, as I thought about, there were other avenues of that. Well, yeah, it's nothing, but you take one grain away, and the beach is not the same. So there's these thoughts. But as I'm walking and trying to get into this, while I was in Chicago, in an effort to try and understand my cousin's new and strange behavior, he had a couple of books there that he was reading. And I said, well, why don't you give me one of those books so I can try and understand some of this? So he gives me a book. And it was something to do with yoga. Something about it. I don't even remember the title. I can see the cover, though. And so I opened it and started to read. I read a paragraph. And in reading it, nothing about it registered. So I just put the book down and just forgot about it. But while I'm walking in the park, trying to think about this conversation, that one little paragraph that I had read suddenly pops into my mind. And it was about the breath. It was about breathing. And sort of like a pattern of breathing. It was, what was it? It was just the out-breath, the in-breath, rechaka, kumbhaka, puraka. These are the terms for the thing. And I was thinking about that, and so I started to kind of do this breathing. And as I'm walking, my breath started to synchronize with my step. And I'm thinking about, I am a grain of sand on this beach of life. And what happened was this. There's a place in the park where there was like a stairway going down. And I'll never forget it. Because I could put my finger on the spot where everything shifted for me. So as I'm walking, it was kind of remarkable. In these Hollywood movies, you often have this thing where right when something profound is starting to happen, in the movies, someone may be walking down a busy street, and then all of a sudden, it starts to get quiet. The cars, you don't hear the cars. And everything just kind of goes into this silent bubble. I'm having this happen. So as I'm walking, it's like any outer sorts of sounds become lost. And it's all about the breath, the step, the grain of sand. And what happened is something that really, since having told this story now a number of times, this part of it doesn't get any easier. Because in the attempt to speak about it, I realized why I never spoke about it. Because really, I can't describe. But what happened, as closely as I can describe, is that while walking, in the time it took me to pick up this foot, and before it came down for the very next step, something just broke open inside of me. It was like an egg cracked and everything flowed in. And I could see, I could understand. There was no sense of any sort of feeling that, of an isolated, separate, what I talked about the drop of water, the tension between the surface and me dissolved. And it changed. I mean, for me, it changed everything. So when I talk about the experience of surrender, and when I look to an example for me, and when I talk about invasion of consciousness, and I look to an example for me, the formative example and the touchstone for everything I have done since lies right there. Because it wasn't an idea, it wasn't a concept, it wasn't a feeling, it was an experience of what it can be like to live a life that is without boundaries. And the fact that that is, in fact, a very normal condition. So anyway, go through all of that. And then this is an experience that for me, I wrote about it actually one time. And then I started.
What was the item? Did you remember that you said that you
What was it,
lost
Ella?
something?
It was just, it was just like a little, it was like a
And you would get
jewelry.
pictures when you got home?
I did.
You did?
Yeah, actually I did. I always forget about that part of the story, honestly, because that part, that part becomes meaningless. No, it was something that I had brought out with me, and my father actually was going to get the car keys, and he had picked it up with the car keys. And I found out when I got to New York that he had. And then he gave it back. So it was one of those things, it was just sort of a, but, that keyed something else. But as these things go along.
So did it appear that you were, in terms of that, did that appear to you, what you're calling surrender, did that appear somewhat like grace? Or are you saying that surrendering was a process for you because of all those events, your mind kept being so stretched that you got to a point where you had.
Well, yeah, each point you end up having to give up something that you thought was, first of all, the idea that, meditation, reincarnation, that's something that's valid of consideration. Had to kind of give in to the idea that this needs to be looked into. The idea that people can have headaches taken away from them with nothing, no exchange of any sort of physical thing. I'm looking at it. What's the possibility? Let me open to that. That the breath can be something that can be calming to the point where we can actually make deeper sorts of connection. All of those things are ways, small ways, but you put them all together and they lead to something. I ended up leaving school. I was going to take a term off from school. I was going to an Ivy League school, and it was like something that wasn't smiled upon by my parents at all. Who would? And why are you taking time off? And that was a tough one to describe too. The old thing of I need to find myself. It's like, well, you're here, aren't you? So it was really difficult to put a reasonable sort of response. But I was going to go out to Chicago and actually study with the old man for 3 months. And 3 months ended up going into 13 years until he died, transferring school out there. And then now it's like 40 years since I was going out there for 3 months. But one other thing, because as idyllic as some of this might sound, there is an advice that is given among some sorts of some traditions. I heard it in the Tibetan tradition, that if you really want to learn most deeply from your teacher, don't live with them. Don't live around them. Which is like, that seems like that's bad advice. But the idea is you'll start to find that the people who you regard as wise and who may in fact be wise, they pass gas. They have tempers. They have personalities. And, for many, that realization is enough to kind of defeat any possibility of something deeper breaking in. So you have that sort of thing to deal with. But, dealt with all of that. The old man actually, he died of cancer. He was a cigarette smoker, and he used to joke about how I've given up so many other things. Quit talking to me about giving up cigarettes. In fact, when I die, put one in my casket so I can light up when I get old. He was very humorous about it until he got cancer and could barely smoke anymore. But he's dying. And at a certain point, as much as he was the model and he was the person that I looked to as a spiritual guide, and he was the person, closest of all people, a friend, a mentor, all of those things. In the Mahatma letter, not the Mahatma letters, in At the Feet of the Master, little tiny book. I recommend a lot of these tiny books. That's about all I have time to read these days since I took on this position. There's a phrase that in order for there to be the perfect flow of love and of power, there must be perfect trust. The inability to, again, surrender to the idea that I need to move myself out of the way and trust myself to life or to the fact that this individual has something profound to give. The inability to do that blocks so many things. And even though, I was, all of the good things that had flowed to me flowed largely because of my association with him, still, there was the need in me to be me, in spite of what he may know, in spite of all of that. And so there was, as time went on, probably had the old man not died when he did, it was something where the teaching phase was coming to an end. And what he had to give to me was one of those things that as much as could be given was given. Now you need to get out there and apply it. But he was dying before that happened. And I found myself in this position where, again, this sort of idea of surrender. Because one found out he had pancreatic cancer and that there was no question that this was not going to be reversed. At that point, it was a very clear decision for me that in the days that remain, from the time he found out to the time he actually died was 4 months, that anything that might have been a block to the flow of love, to the flow of connection, I'm not going to allow it in me. And so that was one of those moments where, for that period, I was a primary caregiver. And, anybody who's gone through that knows that it involves an awful lot of things. But that was one of those things where, in terms of, we talk about the wisdom of theosophy or spiritual wisdom, or as if there is spiritual wisdom and there is wisdom in your actions in your life, and the two are not the same, which is a false belief. There's no division. And a theosophy or a Christianity or whatever itty or osophy you choose that does not directly impact your behavior is just a concept that you've embraced, and that's all it is. That has value, but don't kid yourself. So, that to me was something where, again, on a more profound level, the experience of what it means to surrender in the sense of I'm going to move myself out of the way so that something else can take place, it became more of a reality. And as a spiritual experience, it was something that, again, had great benefit.
And how many years were you in Midtown?
13 years.
13 years.
13 years. Lived, worked, a host of things. Go ahead. You don't have to raise your hand, just talk up.
We've been studying theosophy, many of us, for years. And it's a gradual process. But certainly we've never received the level of knowledge that your teacher had. Did he acquire it from books? Well, it sounds like he intuited this knowledge. I also had a teacher in Denver
Mhm.
that intuited or would go into a trance
Mhm.
before a lecture
Mhm.
and come out like she had read 15 books,
Mhm.
done a dissertation, and there was the information.
Yeah.
So how did he acquire it? You walk into my house and I've got a ton of books.
Right.
And I'm still going back to the same book and reading it
Right.
over and over again. So
Now he was a very unusual person. He read, of course, and he got some of it from there. But that kind of helped to shape what was already inside of him. He was one of these people who was born with a clairvoyant ability that was kind of disturbing to his family and things like that, because he would see things, and as a kid, you don't know everybody else doesn't see it. So you'd see somebody come in and say, oh, she's going to die. And then she dies, and it's like, how dare you say something like that about that woman? Or he'd see all kinds of things like that. So, Flem, you're going to say something.
In view of the likelihood that no one is perfect or even approaches it, might not a willingness to display our failures, our problems, our smoking, or whatever it is, actually increase confidentiality in that person who's willing to say, hey, this is me, it's not good here, it's not good there, but maybe I can help you fix your flat tire.
Right.
I don't know.
Right. We used to talk to him a lot, because, he was a meat eater, and I was a vegetarian. A bunch of the people who came to him were vegetarian, and he'd talk to you. And he'd move more people away from vegetarianism. Like, what are you doing? I stuck with it, but they would be on me, because his thing was, you all are up here talking about how bad meat is and all of that. And, if somebody pushed him about his need to become a vegetarian, he would say, well, let me tell you this, what has it done for you? And people would talk about the health benefits and all that. He'd say, before you get so hung up on the health aspect, maybe what you might need to eliminate is some of those thoughts that you carry around with you. And if people pressed him even further, then he'd start naming what the thoughts are, and the ways that you have acted them out. So you got out of trying to convince the old man to become a vegetarian.
But it did a lot for the chicken.
Well, yeah.
When you became a vegetarian.
Oh, for sure.
It did a lot for the chicken.
you mentioned your cousin Derek,
Yeah.
who was already involved
Yeah.
with the old man.
Yeah.
The teaching stuck with you
Yeah.
throughout your lifetime.
Sure.
What about Barrett?
Well, I'll tell you the truth, it's rather remarkable to me, because probably hundreds of people came across. We had a community that was really members of the Theosophical Society, all of us. And it's very interesting to me. Sometimes I do think about that, because of all of the people that came through, certainly some of them are members of the Theosophical Society, but nobody was really, except me, found that as their particular field of service. They're out there doing other things. And all of them have been touched by this, and they apply it in different ways. But to say that Theosophy and the Theosophical Society is where it's at was not something that anybody else embraced. So it makes me think. It's not to say that there's anything deficient in the Theosophical Society, but now I'm president of the Theosophical Society, and I notice that people join, and perhaps on an average join, and within 2 years allow their membership to drop. And in a certain sense, you think, oh, this must be a failing on the side of the Theosophical Society. But in another sense, what I recognize is this, that anybody who touches it, you come away with something. And that something colors your activity and colors your life and colors your behavior far past the moment that you said yes on an application form. And so that has great value. There's this idea in, again, another little book, Light on the Path by Mabel Collins. Not Light on the Path itself, but at the end of it, there's a really short article about karma. And it's a fascinating one because it begins with an image. And the image is of a clear, very pure thread. You know, it has many fibers that make up this thread. And that you follow this thread, and that at a certain point, it passes through many places, and it passes through many situations. And at a certain point, you'll see, if you follow it, it passes through, and whatever it is there kind of soils it or colors it. And so that as that thread comes through, it's colored by this previous experience. And it might color it for good or bad. Or it gets hung up on something and a little thread gets popped out of it. But it's an example, and it's a very profound little article, really. But talking about karma. And with each of us, every single thing that we touch impacts us, and often in ways that we don't know. They have people that will go for massage, and they'll have somebody working on their shoulders, and suddenly they'll just break down crying. And the term that is used is muscle memory, that very often people have experiences that are perhaps too traumatic for them to properly process, and it gets buried. And it associates itself in different parts of the body, affects your health. But then there'll be this moment when it's released. And this sort of process is something that's going on continuously. And so that's why we need the tools to address that, so that we don't end up suppressing and locking up the energy in these sort of capsules within the body through which then the flow naturally does not occur. So that's the sort of thing that it all has its impact. And has something she wants to say.
Well, we want to thank you so much for being here with us today, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you.